Our next guest is the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, Dr. John R. Lott, and he joins us now. How's it going?
Oh, great to see you again.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. So tell us about the Crime Prevention Research Center.
Well, it's a group of academics who do research on guns and crime and policing issues. You have people like Michael Bloomberg and George Soros who are spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars putting out false research, as well as other groups. And, we know where the numbers are. And not only can we respond when incorrect information is put out, but we can put out our own studies that can help be more accurate and help inform people about what's actually happening with regard to gun ownership and crime.
Absolutely. And something interesting I came across was an article that you contributed to the New York Times, which doesn't have the greatest reputation for being pro-gun. How did that come about?
Well, basically what happens is every couple months, the New York Times and now even the Wall Street Journal have been repeating claims by the Violence Policy Center. They have a report called Concealed Killers, where they go and claim now that the last 10 years, concealed carry permit holders have been responsible for the deaths of 969 people in the United States, about 96 a year. The problem with it is they aren't willing to go and talk about all the errors that are in there. I'll just give you one example. Supposedly 40% of all those deaths occur in Michigan. And what they do, I guess Michigan would be surprised by this, but they do a couple things. One is they claim that 79 of the deaths are from homicides that permit holders have committed. But the way they put this together is they'll count news stories, and then what they'll do is the state police put out a report every year of pending cases and convictions. So let's say you have a case where it gets news coverage, and if a permit holder uses a gun in public to protect themselves, unless the police are completely sure, they're going to arrest the person.
Yeah.
There's a newspaper story, and then let's say it's pending for 3 years. It occurs in December 1 year and isn't cleared for 14 months. That's going to be listed as 3 pending cases plus article. And so they count that as 4 separate cases, even if the person is found to have acted in justifiable self-defense. So, it's just crazy stuff like that. When they have the big number that they have there is every year the Michigan State Police lists the number of permit holders who have committed suicide. They don't break it down by whether the suicide was committed with a gun or whether it was in the home, which is where the vast majority of suicides are, and so a permit wouldn't have made any difference in most cases anyway. But, the interesting thing is if you look at the suicide rate for concealed carry permit holders in Michigan, it's just 38% of the rate of the suicide rate in the general population. So to go and somehow imply that having a concealed carry permit caused these guys to go and commit suicide is just really ridiculously poorly done. But, that's just an example for one state, which they claim is the worst state with 40% of the deaths.
Standing on false correlation is par for the course for the other side, as far as I've been seeing, at least within the years that I've been doing this. And, and they understand that people will just take information wholesale, never question it, never look and check what the actual the variables that were conducted and controlled for with respect to whatever research or statistic that they put out there. And they bank on the lowest common denominator when it comes to putting out this information. Just on a personal level, how do you deal with, if there are any, frustrations that come with you going out of your way to make sure that the information you have is correct that you put out there, and then having to contend with another side and a group of people who don't necessarily use the same level of integrity with respect to their research and how they go about conducting it, and subsequently putting out that information? That's got to be incredibly frustrating.
It is. I guess you hope that when somebody takes the time to go and look through it, they'll realize kind of even obvious false errors that they made. So, I think anybody can understand if you count a case where there's a news story and then count it for each of the calendar years pending case, you get 4 cases where there's only 1, and even that was found to have been justifiable self-defense. You gotta wonder whether they have any credibility left. I mean, I've written multiple letters to the New York Times. Of course, they won't publish any of these things. But, you know, the thing is, I assume the New York Times and the Violence Policy Center are what you're saying. They just will assume that people won't check these things. And, you know, they'll just go on it because it fits their preconceptions. But here's the thing. These numbers are going to be important later on this year or next when they have the reciprocity bill go up before the Senate, and there's going to be a filibuster. And if we can put this stuff together in simple forms that can be talked about on the Senate floor. So, you know, if somebody goes and cites the Violence Policy Center stuff, and I guarantee you they will in that form, hopefully somebody else is going to be able to take a couple minutes and educate them on that. And then they're going to be hopefully embarrassed because they're not response. I mean, what are they going to say? Well, we really should have counted this case 4 times, even though it shouldn't have been counted even once.
Right. No, it's definitely, you know, like I always say, our biggest role and our biggest job with respect to what we do for the Second Amendment is to put out that counter information, because be the counter to the misinformation with respect to firearms. Because you're right, you'll get people who will get on the Senate floor and literally just regurgitate what they read in an article from the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, and then stake their entire case on that. And then it sounds good. And I've noticed the other side, they have an excellent command of the English language, and being able to kind of pull at the heartstrings of people with the way they kind of craft their stats and then the messaging they wrap around it. And then people like you and I tend to have to get lost in the kind of more sterile, hardcore facts of things, and people don't usually necessarily resonate with that. So now we have to then, after doing the painstaking work of trying to figure out, you know, what's the actual truth behind these stats, then we have to then create this message, like you said, that simplifies it enough so that people can understand and really digest it in a way so that they can understand how the other stats and pieces of information that were put out there were incredibly false or wrong or deceptive. But I mean, it is what it is. I guess we just gotta have to continue to do what we do in that regard, especially from your standpoint.
I just
go ahead.
follow up on what you said for a second. Mm-hmm. That is, you talk about tugging at the heartstrings, but you know, one of the big things that's going to be coming up in the reciprocity debate is kind of these quote killer amendments that the Democrats are going to try to put on. For example, things like having background checks on private transfers of guns. To me, I actually hope that they do, because I think there are things that we can do to embarrass them. I'll just give one example, and that is, you know, I have no problems with background checks per se, as long as the system is working well. Yeah. And so, for example, about 99% of the people who are stopped from buying a gun because of criminal background checks are what we call false positives, simply where the government's made a mistake. Yeah. Well, and the thing is, it's the most vulnerable people who often get stopped disproportionately. You know, people tend to have names similar to others in their racial group. Hispanics have names some of their Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names to other blacks. And the thing is, there's no reason why any of those mistakes should occur. Why not put up an amendment that just says, look, the federal government has to meet the same regulations for doing background checks that the federal government requires private companies to. And let them explain why they won't do that. Or if we have these costs, you know, in Washington, D.C., where these politicians are, it costs $150 to privately transfer a gun there. I mean, well, who do they think they're stopping from being able to go and buy a gun in that case? If you believe that these background checks reduce crime, then they're going to reduce crime for everybody, not just the person who's buying the gun. So if everybody benefits, then everybody should pay for it out of general revenue. But I guarantee you, if you bring up those types of solutions, the Democrats will go nuts. Well, let them go and try to explain why poor people should have to pay $150 to be able to go and get just a tax, essentially, to be able to get a gun to protect themselves and their family. If they're trying to buy a $300 gun, $150 may make the difference between whether or not that family is going to be able to go and protect themselves. Why should only wealthy people have the option to be able to go and protect their families? Let Democrats explain why they insist on imposing these high penalties, essentially, on the most vulnerable people in our society.
Absolutely. No, it's and the interesting thing about it is, though, they don't resonate with that language because they don't believe the idea of owning a firearm is an adequate means in which to protect someone's self. They legitimately believe that we don't need them. So when you make an argument that tells them, well, why would you make it harder for someone who makes less money to get a firearm to protect their lives with? Like, you're essentially creating an elite class of people. You're essentially basically saying that someone who makes more money's life is worth more than somebody else's life who doesn't make as much
Right.
money, because you're creating laws that affect people economically disproportionately. But in their minds, they don't see the gun as a necessity. They don't see
Well,
the. Go ahead.
my response would be, you have people like Michael Bloomberg who
Mm-hmm.
thinks guns are valuable for self-defense because he has armed bodyguards, not just for himself, but for the other executives within the Everytown movement there. Other groups do too. Rosie O'Donnell, Mayor Daley when he was mayor of Chicago. These guys understand the benefits to protection for themselves. It shouldn't just be limited to them.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about the argument you just made there, that literally forces them to admit that, well, yeah, that's because they'll largely say, well, they really need it because of who they are, which essentially is them saying they're better than you. And so hopefully we can have the requisite people in place when we start having these debates and these discussions who can get up there and make those arguments so that they are forced to admit the fallacies that they are.
Well, I'm glad you're there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Sean. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. And as I said before, you're always welcome on the show anytime you want to come on.
Well, thank you. I greatly appreciate that.
Absolutely. You have a good one.
Same to you.
All right. We're going to take a quick break and then find out about the latest guns coming from overseas.